World Monuments Fund Britain. I'm Clarissa Levi, Art and Heritage Counsel at Wedlake Bell.
And I'm Richard Harwood. I'm a barrister at 39 Essex Chambers.
And we're joined today by Magnus von Wistinghausen, Executive Director of World Monuments Fund Britain. So, hi Magnus, thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you for asking me.
To start, would you like to introduce yourself and what has brought you to your place in World Monuments Fund Britain?
Yes, so I would describe myself as a continental European Londoner. I was one of those hundreds of thousands of Europeans who arrived on these shores from the late 80s to the early 90s. I was an economist at the time. I worked in investment banking for some years, and then I kind of diverted into something that I always felt was of greater interest to me, which is broadly the world of culture and heritage. And I had a few chapters, which ultimately 3 years ago led me to this position I currently hold as Executive Director of World Monuments Fund Britain. So that's in a nutshell. Perhaps reflecting a little bit on my interest in heritage. I come from a family with a deep sense of rootedness in history, but equally a family where I've witnessed kind of two sides. One is a story of loss, and the other is very much a story of continuity. And so I kind of grew up with that sense of what it means to lose, what constitutes your identity and how you deal with that. And the other is, how you deal with, in a way, the opposite, which is continuity, and how continuity actually also involves change. And for some reason, I don't know why, from an early age onwards, I kind of picked that up as a theme. And I suppose that's what ultimately led me to become involved in the field of heritage.
I suppose it shows you exactly why heritage is important.
So how did loss and continuity run in the family? What was the trigger for that?
So on my father's side, the Wistinghausen family were Baltic Germans. So we were part of the wider Swedish dominions, but later the Russian Empire. And of course, that story came to an abrupt end at the beginning of the 20th century after the Russian Revolution. And so, that world vanished. I mean, literally completely vanished over a period of 20 years. And so I grew up within that kind of diaspora that had formed itself in different parts of the world. And in my case, West Germany. And on my mother's side, it's a Belgian family with roots in France, also in Switzerland. And there, it's the opposite. It's kind of a long continuity with built heritage kind of still very much at the heart of the family and the family's identity. But there again, you pass from one generation to the next, there is always change. So it's this idea that change is inherent in the human condition. It's inherent really in everything. And therefore, when we think about heritage, it's not really about stopping change, but how we manage it. And when I came to this country and became more aware of the way the British heritage world operates, there was a kind of a mantra that really spoke to me, which is how the National Trust describes heritage as the considered management of change. It's not something I necessarily grew up with, but it kind of stuck with me.
Okay, and you've seen, being in Britain and living in Britain and working in Britain, you've seen that change possibly from a bit of a distance, and then you've now got involved yourself, Executive Director of the World Monuments Fund. How does that function? What does it do?
So World Monuments Fund is a global independent heritage a not-for-profit organization. We're the only organization of that type that operates across the world. There are much larger organizations than us in national jurisdictions, obviously very, very large ones in this country, some that have a regional focus. But in terms of globally, when we speak globally, we are the only one that operates on that kind of broad international scale. Our DNA is kind of based on field projects. So it's very much how we look at specific situations and what they require, what challenges they face, and what solutions, they can develop. But it's also, and I suppose that's where my background as an economist comes in, it's really looking at heritage really from a macroeconomic perspective. So seeing heritage preservation as central to achieving social change and looking at, yes, they are expressions of great cultural achievements of our forebears, and that's why we care about them, but also recognizing that they continue to have a central importance to understanding who we are, to forge links within our societies, to create opportunities, etc. And I think that's really core to our DNA and how we operate. And you can perhaps see how that relates to what I was saying earlier about my own personal trajectory.
So it's a sort of a social role of heritage and is also an economic development role of heritage?
Absolutely, absolutely, yes. We may speak about that later, because obviously there are themes around that where there are economic roles, but economic roles that sometimes can turn themselves into big challenges as well.
It strikes me that heritage in the UK is actually already very strongly supported and funded. And there are many organisations, as you've already touched on, in the UK that are in support of heritage. So I'm interested to just explore a bit how World Monuments Fund Britain fits into the landscape, really, how it works with other organisations that we already have.
You're quite right, of course. It's probably the UK heritage ecosystem is the most developed in the whole world, and actually it's very well known for that. It's actually, I would argue, not just me, a great factor of soft power for this country. And so what our role really is, the way we understand our role within this country, is to really provide a what we call a window onto the world. What the UK heritage sector often lacks are the resources to venture beyond national borders. It's got a very active, as I said, ecosystem and a very active mode of exchange internally. But perhaps comparing and contrasting it with the world of the arts and museums and academia, it has less evolved mechanisms and networks for sharing expertise across borders and exchanging. And when we look at where the resource is focused, it's very much on investment, on capital investment, on maintenance, etc. So I think our role is just to create these bridges between what happens in this country, what happens in other countries, leveraging the incredible expertise and experience that has developed over the years here, bringing that to bear on projects internationally, but then also allowing, as I said, opening out that window for heritage actors in this country to engage with their peers internationally. Of course, we're not alone in that. Some of this is also down out of historic England. There's obviously the British Council with its Cultural Protection Fund. UNESCO is represented in this country and its sub-organizations, ICOMOS and others. There's into the International National Trust Organization. So, obviously we're not the only players here, but I think what we bring is this live and constantly shifting and developing portfolio of live projects across pretty much all geographies. And I think that gives us opportunities that are particular and complementary to what others offer.
And is World Monuments Fund Britain, does it operate differently to affiliates in other countries, WMF affiliates elsewhere?
Yeah, so as an organization, I should kind of clarify, we are headquartered in New York, and then we operate on the basis of outposts, which we call affiliates around the world. So we here in Britain are one of currently 7 affiliates. And that includes Peru, it includes the Iberic Peninsula, France, and now Italy in Europe, China and India. And then, of course, we also have representatives in other regions. So I think every affiliate operates in different ways because it responds obviously to the ecosystem within which it is. So if I contrast our position in the UK, which I've talked about, with that, for example, in Peru, we are the only kind of non-government NGO in the heritage space. That's a very, very different position to be in. It means that when we get involved in the project, we usually are there from the beginning to the end. We usually provide not just seed funding, which is what we do in this country. We actually provide the most of the funding to deliver the whole project. And I suppose there we have a much bigger kind of national role to play, as opposed to being part of a bigger ecosystem, which is really what is the case here.
Just thinking of the UK ecosystem, we have the national regulatory bodies like Historic England. We have the big organisations which either own or manage, like National Trust or English Heritage, and lots of smaller organisations. And then the Specialist Amenity Society and campaign groups. So when 2 of them are hosted in the same building, you're on Cowcross Street, 20th Century Society is a Amenity Society, and say Britain's Heritage as a more campaigning organisation within that. How does, in terms of what you do in Britain, the World Monuments Fund fit into that sort of range of bodies in terms of what do you do particularly within that ecosystem?
I suppose, we get involved in all sorts of different ways. We do come into advocacy campaigns. We do that primarily through a program which we could talk about more later with some concrete examples, called The Watch, which is our global biannual advocacy program, which allows anyone around the world to nominate sites at risk or facing a particular challenge. And we always have a good number of nominations there, which then end up one site, being particularly highlighted. So that's one way. I think the other way to describe how we operate in this country is we always work in partnership. We are obviously not asset owning institution. So we would identify projects that have the ability to be part of developing a particular solution to a particular challenge, which we see as being mirrored in other parts of the world. So we would basically quite deliberately then get involved in that, because we see this as an opportunity to see how a particular situation gets addressed in this country and how that can then be kind of possibly mirrored or shared with similar sites internationally, and conversely, how we can bring some of the experiences internationally into this country. And again, there are a few projects, I could talk about more that exemplify that.
So in terms of projects at the moment, let's talk first of all about partnerships. There's a particularly interesting partnership scheme you've got on at the moment?
So one I would mention perhaps initially is a program called Coastal Connections, which initially was a partnership with English Heritage. It came out of a nomination to our Watch program, which highlighted the issues surrounding Hurst Castle on the Solent, one of the many coastal heritage sites dealing with the impact of climate change, general kind of coastal erosion. And the principle around that project was from the beginning not to focus on that site, but to take that site as the starting point of a global conversation of heritage sites around the world. And so Coastal Connection, within the first 2 years of its existence, developed into a conversation amongst about 60 sites in coastal regions and managers of these sites. And it was really an experiment to see, how that might work. And I think what we found was that not only was there a lot of confluence, as it were, of issues, but also a real kind of sense of the value of sharing these experiences. I think we forget that a lot of heritage professionals operating in certain sites operate very much in quite an isolated context, and the sense of not being alone and having a community of colleagues to speak to, not just nationally, but internationally, something of great value. And so the evidence that we brought together has now enabled us to go into the next phase, which incidentally is funded by a British funding partner, the Lloyd's Register Foundation. And this now focuses on creating training hubs in global South regions, such as at the moment, the Swahili coast. So I think this is a very good way of explaining how, as an organization, we can start off bringing a large national partner into this kind of exchange and then kind of leverage support, both technically in terms of expertise, but also financially, to benefit heritage places around the world.
And it's also that sort of issue as a lot of people involved who aren't simply in the heritage sector, because of coastal protection, coastal erosion. And on the Solent Castle example, my recollection is that my wife, when she was one of the senior officers at New Forest District Council, was involved in some of the issues on that, because it was quite a major collapse, which took, I think, quite a bit of the site out and put a lot of it, the rest of it, at risk. But that's all has to be looked at in the context of coastal erosion, as well as individual heritage sites.
I mean, this has been a project that has very much also built in the question of how do you manage change. I mean, again, we said earlier that change is all around us and it happens all the time. I think, the technical opportunities which, the Industrial Revolution, the 19th century, the 20th century brought us, I think probably got us to the point of thinking that we can, if not arrest change, really slow it down. And now kind of we're into a very different world where, in effect, the acceleration of change is something that we can no longer ignore and we can no longer stem. And so in a way, the conversation becomes more dynamic and to some extent more interesting, because it's about, okay, if we accept that change and that sometimes change can lead to loss, how can we manage that in a way which is respectful and planned? So we're sort of, as an organization, we're trying to identify situation which allow us kind of to slightly push those boundaries of how certain situations are addressed.
I love that. In this country, I'd say I agree with you. good at working with the reality of how heritage is always moving. And it reminds me, actually, to quote again somebody that I once spoke to, a curator in the National Trust. They were considering how to display objects in a house. And they said, well, we don't want it to be a mausoleum to the collecting taste of a particular person in the 19th century. It has to adapt and change. I mean, it's just obviously the only way really to work with heritage is to accept all the things that you've said, that it's not going to be set in stone forever.
I would add to that in a way, if we can't put heritage at the center of social change, then we're eroding gradually the consensus on which our ability to support it financially and resource-wise is based. I mean, at the end of the day, in the long term, it's about social consensus, isn't it? And so by bringing heritage and constructing projects which are not just about conserving, but they're also about making them relevant to today, which includes job creation. It includes kind of, for example, we've had some interesting conversations with the organization looking after cemeteries, which are, and thinking about what can cemeteries, which are no longer burial places, if we want to look after them, how can we bring them in as green spaces, into urban environments? We have a program called Cultivating Resilience, which looks at the climate resilience of historic green spaces. And again, we're looking at not just, again, conserving the green spaces or necessarily bringing them back to their original state, which obviously you can't in that world anyway, but also to rethink what these places can deliver for the communities today. And that's really where it becomes very, very interesting.
Yeah, in particular projects which have got that sort of social community focus, that when you're working on putting expertise into a site, you're thinking, well, how is it going to contribute locally and have local people involved?
We're currently developing a project on a wonderful site in Wales at Strata, Florida, which has been dubbed the Westminster Abbey of Wales. And it's a site, that has been effectively in ruins for many centuries and transformed into farmland, etc. And we're at the moment, we're kind of looking at the opportunity to redevelop the site ultimately to become a center of Welsh culture and language, but to do that by ensuring that every step along the way becomes a training opportunity. So working with local colleges and universities so that from the planning stages to development stages, we're always working with students, we're working with apprentices, and to make sure that, yes, we will have a conserved heritage site at the end, but in the process, people's lives and livelihoods will have developed. On a much larger scale, a project that we've been involved with as an organization globally for 35 years is Angkor Wat, where WMF came in as one of the first international organizations after the end of the Pol Pot regime. And for 35 years now, we've been working on different sites, within the archaeological park. And the impact there, again, of course, there's a conservation impact, but an equally important impact is that over these 35 years, we've trained hundreds of people. We've created a new generation of conservation technicians and professionals. These people have been in jobs for all these years. They've been able to build houses, to put their children through school. So, that's really that kind of broader, kind of macroeconomic, at a local level, impact that heritage can create, I think is extremely exciting, and it's extremely important.
How does the Watch program work?
So the Watch is a biannual call. We're actually in the process of assessing the submissions for the next cycle. Anyone around the world over a period of 3 to 4 months can submit a nomination about a site of significance, obviously to be articulated what that significance means locally, at risk of some description, but also with an opportunity for change. And so we then look at the sum total of these applications. And this year we've received between 350 and 400 from all over the world. And we then whittle them down to over a process of internal assessment, but also a kind of external expertise and ultimately an external panel making final decisions. We're whittling it down to a list of 25 sites. And those 25 sites we then commit to working with over a period of a minimum of 2 years to deliver a project. Now, that project can be either advocacy-based, or it can be about developing a very specific project, seed funding that, bringing in expertise, building capacity locally, etc. So it can be very different. And again, it reflects the realities of different geographies. So taking the UK as an example, our current watch site are the assembly rooms in Belfast, very important building of the late 18th century and then transformed in the 19th century, and a building that had been closed off to the public for more than 20 years and was a classic example of abandonment where a private owner basically wasn't really delivering on its promise of maintaining the building. So we, through the watch, we joined a public campaign, and that watch moment created a sense of, urgency, a greater sense of urgency, and galvanized ultimately a process which led Belfast City Council to acquire the building at the end of last year. And we're now working with the council on plans to develop the building for future public use. So this is something where, again, we come in, we back a coalition, we join a coalition, and then we commit expertise and some funding towards it.
So it's not necessarily making the change as an organisation. I mean, one organisation can presumably do that, but it's more, if I'm understanding right, shining a spotlight and forcing change in that way.
Yes, we're not an organisation that kind of helicopters around the world and decides, this is important, that's important. I think the principle has always been is responding to something that is brought to our attention. Of course, looking at it through a strategic lens. Obviously, we can't get involved in everything. And therefore, it's really always a combination of how significant is the site, both in terms of kind of obviously locally, culturally, but also kind of globally. It also is a sense of timing. Is this the right moment? And that's in terms of both risk, but also opportunity. So is this the moment to become involved? Is there within the period of 24 months, how can we realistically kind of achieve something? And of course, that's always connected with the question as to who are our partners on the ground. So it's a sort of quite a subtle set of considerations that come into those decisions. And you can imagine whittling something down from 350 to 25 is quite a task. And of course, you want a list that's a curated list that gives also a broader sense of where heritage is at any particular moment in time.
But it's very much looking at a sort of practical approach, somewhere you can deliver. So the Belfast Assembly Rooms in the Cathedral Quarter, that's there which has been sort of coming up in Belfast in recent years. The Assembly Rooms always seem to be a little bit sort of set back from some of the routes through there, but the potential, you think, is there, that the interest is there, City Council involved and so on, that you can move it forward. It's a cry of optimism rather than a cry of despair about these sites.
Absolutely. And just to give another example, because there's recently been some good news in the media as well, is are the Moseley Road baths in Birmingham, which were our watch site in the UK in 2016, at a time when Birmingham City Council was more than threatening, actually had started the process of closing the building and mothballing it. And again, a group of local activists submitted this incredible Edwardian swimming baths, that continue to play an important role in the local community, to the watch. And that kind of putting it on the global list and forming a coalition around a new project relatively quickly led Birmingham to reconsider its decision to close. And then came obviously a long period of developing plans for its long-term restoration. But, we're now at the stage a couple of weeks ago when there was an announcement of a further significant grants from the National Lottery Heritage Fund, which has now basically completed the campaign of £30 million to restore and bring back to life the entire complex. So again, obviously we can't claim all of that for ourselves, but there was this important moment of having an international body coming in and saying, look, this is an important building. It's on the same list where the Taj Mahal was only a few years ago. And it does trigger change, or trigger stakeholders to reconsider and local communities to feel emboldened to embrace action.
Speaking of action, I suppose, what would you see from your international work as the most urgent challenge for heritage today?
Well, I suppose if you'd asked me that question about 6 to 12 months ago, we would have said climate. Obviously, climate impact is all with us. We know that 80% of UNESCO's World Heritage Sites are already experiencing harmful climate stress. We know that 90% of Mediterranean coastal sites will be affected by sea level. So, those are just two sets of statistics. But equally, we know that heritage also offers solutions. So it's not only the doom and gloom. We see this as an opportunity to actually bring heritage right into the center of a much bigger debate. And by choosing carefully which projects we get involved with, to show how heritage can be part of a solution, not just by applying contemporary technology, but actually sometimes going back to the wisdoms of old times, to traditional solutions, to reviving certain craft skills, etc. So that's what I would have said 6 months ago is the number one. But actually, sadly, if you look at what's been happening in the last 6 to 12 months, it's really conflict that is the greatest current and daily threat to heritage. And again, just to quote a few statistics, or rather distressing, more than 50% of World Heritage sites located in conflict zones have suffered damage or destructions in the last 10 to 15 years. And of course, just looking at the last 12 months since March 2026, and of course, those numbers will have increased with every single day. UNESCO has verified damage at more than 525 sites in Ukraine, 164 sites in Gaza since October 7th, 23, 140 sites in Iran, 25 sites, probably a lot more since then in Lebanon. So, this is really something that is now on a scale, and it is brought, to our screens on a daily basis, which we can't ignore. And of course, what you do about that, I think for us, the realization is that, or not just for us, obviously, is that in a way, too few governments have really integrated cultural protection into the humanitarian and security frameworks. And I think that is something which is beginning to be acknowledged, and certain countries are beginning to build heritage protection into their crisis/conflict preparedness models. We could obviously we talked earlier about economic impact. One of our strategic themes at WMF is imbalanced tourism. So obviously tourism, on the one hand, being one of heritage's greatest economic allies, and global tourism, I think, accounts for something like 10% of global GDP, etc. I think those are very much, the arguments that have been brought forward since the 1980s and 90s onwards. So the economic impact, of culture, and in this case of heritage. But equally, we all know that this economic benefit is very unequally distributed. So at the moment, the top 10 most visited destinations around the world receive allegedly 40% of all tourists. We know the example of Venice. 120 visitors for every resident per annum. I was in Rome recently, and you can barely move on the square in front of the Pantheon from 8:30, 9 o'clock onwards. So anyway, these are big issues. And of course, if you venture further out, there's the issue of, the economic benefit of tourism. Who does it accrue to? And it very often does not accrue to the communities actually immediately surrounding the heritage. And so there are immense imbalances that we need to address. It's another big task. So I suppose, those are the big things that we are aware of. And then obviously connected to that is the whole question of the vanishing skills base around heritage, which of course is something that we talk a lot about here in this country, but it happens all over the world for all sorts of different reasons. And so again, as an organization, we can't solve this, but what we want to make sure is every single project we get involved with has built in the skills training and capacity building that has to be part of the investment that is made at every site we become involved with. And I'm sure we're not the only ones thinking along those same lines.
Well, it's wonderful to hear about the optimism and all the endeavours that are in hand, because there's obviously a lot of work to be done from everything you say, Magnus, but a great deal of enthusiasm for doing it.
Yeah, as an organization, we really feel that what we're trying to be a part of is really bringing this very strong civil kind of society-led global voice to bear, and bringing more and more partners, to work together, because it's together we're stronger, and together we can make the case better for why these places matter in all sorts of different ways and why we should care for them, not only out of respect for the past, but very much out of an understanding of the opportunities in the present, and leaving space, for the future to make its own decisions.
Well, if I may say so, that's a lovely place to leave it, because that is exactly why we're here. Thank you so much, Magnus.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Art and Heritage Law Contested Heritage. Please do follow or subscribe on Apple or Spotify podcasts to enjoy more shows.
We have a new podcast out every fortnight. If you're able, please take the time to rate us and put down a review.
The show is also on the 39 Essex Chambers website, along with podcast series on topics such as artificial intelligence, climate change and planning.